It's Grinnell, Iowa, about 50 miles east of Des Moines. Population 8,500, not counting the college students. We're at the junction of two railroads down here and about 4 miles north of Interstate 80. We got our start some 150 years ago as a farm market, and we're still very close to the soil. The cornfields begin right at the edge of town. But along the way, we've acquired light industry, a hospital, major retirement facilities, oh, and if I do say so myself, a very fine liberal arts college. Along with all this change, we've acquired some interesting history. Fortunately, there's some Grinnellians around who helped make it, who can tell us what life was like here 50, 60, even 70 years ago. We've asked a few of them to do just that, and to concentrate on the years of the Great Depression and the war that followed. Anna Ramsey remembers. Anna, I know your father had his own business in town, and you and your sisters were little girls, or young girls, during the period of the
Correct.
20s and 30s. Tell me a little bit about what it was like at that time.
Well, I considered it to be a very good time of my life. Things went well. We had lots of opportunities to do things, like taking piano lessons and taking dancing lessons at the college and one thing and another. And it was a very, very happy time of my life.
And then when the economic circumstances began to get bad,
well, yes, we all were to go through college. This was the idea. And my older sister and my next sister did finish, as did I, except I started in when things were very, very tough. And I had 2 years of music. I wanted to be a music major. And it got to the place where to take music, which cost extra, I couldn't do it. So then I switched in an economics major, which was a very peculiar switch from music to economics. But I did get through school and graduated. My sisters were teaching, they helped me. And so that's how we survived.
I understand that as the banks began to fail in the 20s, that you had a significant investment that you lost.
Yes. Actually, it was in 1924, I'm sure the fall of 20, when the bank, which was known as the Merchants National Bank, which is the Sullivan Bank, had a note on the window which said closed. This was 24. This was earlier than we think about Depression somehow. Depression came early to Grinnell. And it was rather interesting because we had money from the sale of our beloved pony and all the trappings, the cart and the bobsled and everything that went with it. And we had sold it. And we had taken the money and had purchased war stamps and bonds. Well, then they became due, or we could get our money out. So it was all divided equally between the three of us, among the three of us, and the money was put in each one of our savings accounts. My sister was entering her senior year at Grinnell, and she was really a little upset that she had that money there, and her clothes weren't very new. So she just decided that she'd take her money out of the bank and buy some clothes before she started her senior year. That was just, my father couldn't believe that you did things like that. But bless her heart, she did it. And so she went to Des Moines and came back with, I thought, the most beautiful clothes I'd ever seen. And so she had her clothes, had a lovely year at Grinnell, went off to teach. And my other sister and I lost all of our money in the bank. And I mean lost it. It was for years. And when it finally was settled, we had 6 cents on the dollar out of our bank. So it was very smart. And as you say, maybe we should just do things we want to do and not worry about it.
Like Anna Ramsey, Sid Potts grew up in Grinnell and was a teenager when the banks failed. Only her family circumstances weren't quite as favorable. Tell us a little bit, Sid, about growing up in Grinnell and about the Gem Cafe.
Well, the Gem Cafe was quite a place in Grinnell in those years. Of course, we had the railroads at that time, and things were a little difficult. My mother and father were divorced when I was 6 years old and my brother was a baby. And the restaurant was a way of making a living for my mother. She worked from 7 in the morning until 7 at night, 7 days a week, which was a little bit different than they're working now. And the railroad was very active at that time. And it stopped always at 5 o'clock, and the brakeman would say, "Out for lunch," and they would come into the restaurant, and we would have hamburgers, coffee, and pie ready, so it didn't take them very long. And then at 20 minutes after 5, the brakeman would come in and blow his whistle, and he'd say, "All aboard."
Well, of course, I was born in 1914, and so I remember the break and depression of 19, 20, and 21. And then it never got better until it got worse. So in 1929 and 30 and 31, 32, it was just worse than it had been before. But everybody, there were people who lost their farms, many farms in 19, 20, and 21.
That was good. What's the name of that tune?
Precious Memories.
Well, this is Martin Pierce, and Martin Pierce is in Westfield. And I think maybe the best thing to do is to ask Martin to tell us just where Westfield is.
Well, it's about 4.5, maybe 5 miles southwest of Grinnell, Iowa.
And then it was a little community here.
Yeah, it's been a community for years. It was almost a town before Grinnell was even started. There was a stagecoach stop over here for horses and a big barn where they changed horses to go on through. Everybody was real community minded, I'll say that, and real close neighbors, and everybody was willing to stop whatever they were doing to help somebody else when they needed it. And we never kept track of time that we worked for a neighbor. We just, when they needed us, we'd go, and when I needed them, they were here.
If one had to have something done, like with the oats or haying especially, why you'd have more men, and they would gather, and sometimes there would be several of them that would come to help. And then when they did theirs, why, of course, Leonard always went back to help them.
Augusta Peterson belonged to yet another farm family as a parent, and she remembers well what it was like trying to raise a family during those hard times. Tell us a little bit about some of the things that happened when you were trying to raise a family during the late 20s and the early 30s.
It was a lot harder then because we didn't have electricity to have all this works, and we did have kerosene lamps which had to be filled, and lanterns, and we didn't have running water. We had to carry our water from our well, drinking water, but we did have the cistern which ran off of the top of the house into there, and we used that to take baths and things like that in, which we took in wash tubs in the kitchen, and we'd just have to take turns doing that.
Would you keep that water warm on the stove all the time?
Well, we had a reservoir on the back of this old range, and that was just about right to take a bath in. And if we needed a little cooler, we'd add a little more of the cold water.
We lived a lot like the old pioneers. Everybody that I know had a garden, and we had a basement. We called it the cellar. And we'd always had a bin there that we'd always fill up with potatoes. That'd last us all winter and maybe up into the summer. And my mother canned an awful lot of fruits and vegetables and even some meat. That big garden was a lot of it. And then every farmer, there were farmers on a lot closer neighbors, a lot of 80-acre farms that took care of a whole family, see. And every farmer had a few milk cows, and we always milked and separated our milk, and we had to sell the cream. We didn't sell whole milk, we'd sell the cream. We'd have all this milk left over, and it was good for hogs, so almost every farmer had a few cows, and he raised a few hogs, and we were kind of self-sufficient that way. We churned our own butter from the milk, and we, like I say, we had stuff stored in the basement, and we always, and everybody had a few chickens, and we always had eggs. That's the way we survived the hard times, was enough income to buy a few clothes that we needed, a new pair of shoes once in a while, and a few groceries. With the cream and the egg check, we'd go to town Saturday night and take the cream and eggs and spend it almost all for groceries.
Without a refrigerator, though, we had to take care of the meat, have it salted and smoked. And then the beef especially, we cold packed. So now they prep instead of cold packing it.
Tell me what cold packing is.
Well, cold packing is when we took this boiler that would hold 16 quarts, and we would put quart jars, filled them with meat, and then we would cover it, really cover good with water, and then we would boil that for at least 3 hours, and that would keep. And we never had any trouble with spoilage.
Everybody was obligated to stay on the farm until they was 21.
We're at the farm of Dick Sears. We're about 7 miles north of Grinnell, and this is a century farm. Dick, maybe you can tell me what a century farm means.
Well, it means a farm that's been owned in the same family continuously for 100 years or more.
For 100 years.
And this has been in the same family for 100 and, well, it was in 1883. So it's about 110 years.
Over 100 years, isn't it? And were you born here?
I was born here and lived here all my life, and the only move we made was across the road when we were married, and then we moved back a few years later to the home place here.
Well, you must.
And my parents lived over there then.
Is that right? You must feel pretty good about this century farm.
It is a good feeling, and it's a person feels fairly secure. Had an interest in a place for this many years.
Talking to Grant Gale, physics professor at Grinnell College, in Grant's office, and we're talking about all that bad weather that they had in the 30s.
Yes, the 34, 35, 36, 37, for some reason, were the hottest, driest summers on record and the coldest, wettest, snowiest winters on record. So that the combination, of course, nationally produced what is now known as the Dust Bowl. And my journal shows that we had dust storms here in Iowa in the middle of winter, which indicates how badly the soil was eroding. And so the farmers, in the first place, had no crops, and what crops they did have, they couldn't sell. And I checked with one of the women down at the Mayflower home, and I said, "Is it true that you really burn coal? I mean, burn corn instead of coal?" And yes, for 2 reasons, or 3 reasons. She said, one, corn was selling for 3 or 4 cents a bushel, and we really couldn't sell it. And you couldn't get coal because you couldn't get to town to get coal, so that you had to burn something, so they burned coal. But the railroads were stalled here for weeks at a time, and the college had a big supply of coal. At that time we burned coal. And So the college opened up the dormitories and the gymnasiums, and we housed town people up here. So that was a real crisis as far as the weather is concerned.
36 was the worst winter that we had. I think it was 60 inches of snow that we had in 36.
How'd you get around?
Well, we certainly didn't fire the time, but there was 28 days that there was no car by here, just sleds and bobsleds and teams of horses. So there was no road that they could get through.
So if you went to Grinnell, you'd have to get there by
Teams.
horse and bobsled.
Yeah.
Was that always possible? I mean, was it always possible to take a sled along through the snow drifts and everything?
Well, there were some days you couldn't go. They'd have to shovel some snow and work to get a team through even. And the snow was so deep that there was a long time that the road was closed right down here. So people would come up through our yard and go out through the field, and then at the other end they'd drive right over, the teams right over the fences. The horses would walk right over the top of the snow.
We planted, I think, 20 acres of barley up on good level land, and it grew. It started growing, and it got up about 6 inches high, and then it's dry, and it started going down. Now, I always thought it was the dry weather that killed it, but I look at it now, and I realize it must have been the chinch bugs that really finished it off, because in a little while that whole field just turned, it was just bare dirt. There wasn't a weed, there wasn't a blade of grass or anything on that field. With the dry weather and the chinch bugs wiped that out.
Grant, I understand that there was a barter system for tuition during the Depression.
Well, there was a barter system for more than tuition. See, actually, the system of scrip, which I told you about, was essentially a system of organized barter. In other words, you changed labor for paper money, and so the whole idea of barter was fairly common at that time. And one of the few remains of that at the college here is the fact that our meteorite collection, which we have out here on display, came about in the middle and late 30s. A fellow named Neiniger out at Denver was a fairly well-known meteorite collector, and but he had lots of meteorites but no money. And the college had lots of faculty but no meteorites. So he contacted principally Professor Conard at that time, who was chairman of the faculty, and through Professor Conard and the people in the science division, including me, made an arrangement with Mr. Neiniger so that his daughter and Doris could come as a student, and we took in some meteorites for her tuition, and somehow I think she had a board job, and so we managed to get board and room and meteorites for Doris, and she did well, so she came back the second year as a sophomore, and we got more meteorites, and she came back as the junior and senior, and we kept getting more and more meteorites.
Young people used to realize on a Saturday night, and part of the thing was we'd go to town and the young people would walk around the block, and some would go one way and some would go the other way, and they didn't see who they wanted to, they'd change off again.
Turn around and go the other way.
And it was not where I met my wife, but that's where I asked her for the first date.
I think there were 2 theaters in town at that time, weren't there?
Yes, there were. I think the names were the Lyric and the Colonial, but I'm not sure. And the Lyric showed just movies, and the other theater was the Colonial Theater, which had traveling plays. And we had, there were 2 floors, a balcony and the lower floors, and that was quite a thing to have a date and be invited to go to this theater. And they really were quite, at that time, quite the place to be.
Now that brings us on to a little later date and up close to the period of the Second World War. What were your memories of that period of time? Did that touch you personally?
Well, oh yeah, it touched everybody, of course, but before the war, this Westfield community was going real big. Had a Grange over here, and the Grange sponsored a ball team. We set up a ball diamond over there and got a generator. We didn't have electricity out here then, but we had got a big generator to generate the electricity and light up the old ball diamond, and we was played ball and played all the neighboring towns and everything. But when that old war broke out, that of course that broke up the ball teams. And I had 2 brothers. They both went to service. They interviewed me. I was established. I had my machinery and I had my livestock and was farming a place. And the board decided that best place for me was to stay home and raise food. So I didn't go to service. I always felt a little guilty by not being one of the guys. But I stayed home, and I'm telling you, it was different. You go to town. We used to go to town Saturday night, and then there was a Wednesday night we'd go to town and just goof around and have fun. No more goofing around. There wasn't anybody up there to goof around with.
Really what affected us was our son had to go to World War II. And that was the hard time. But we did get by without his help. Sometimes we'd have to hire help once in a while, but that was the worst part, when he had to go. When you have anyone to go in service, why? When the war is on, of course, if the war isn't on, you don't think so much about it. And he was in the fighting.
Did you notice shortage? Was that tough on you?
Oh, well, we had stamps for everything.
Yeah.
And if anyone was having a baby, they always hoped the baby would come before the last of December so they'd get some shoe stamps. Because, see, it didn't make any difference when it was born, it would get a stamp for that year. And then there was a great deal of trading of stamps. You know, I'd say, well, you know, I really have run out of coffee. Well, I'll stamp if you'll give me some sugar. So this is the way we got along. And then when we would hear that the grocery stores had certain products in, we'd all flock down. They'd have Jell-O, or they'd have marshmallows, or they'd have, the word spread like wildfire. And that's where everybody met everybody else, at the grocery line, waiting to get these rare products.
So at one time we had about 1,200 servicemen on the campus. The biggest program was the SA. This was the Student Army Training Corps. And then we had a STAR unit. This stood for Student Training and Reclassification. And then we have an OCS, an Officers Candidate School.
My children sat up on the curb at 10th Avenue every morning to watch the soldiers go by as they walked down the street, you know, with a hut 2, 3, 4. And all the kids in the neighborhood gathered, you know, 10 o'clock or whatever time it was they went by.
And sometimes momentous events impress themselves on your memory, not only in and of themselves as events, but also you remember what you were doing at that time and how other people reacted. Do you remember the end of the war?
Well, I do. I remember it very well. And I think I've never been more touched than with a memory that I have from the end of the war. My children and I had met Fred in a little town up in the northern part of the state and spent the weekend. He was working for the USO. And so we had come back by train from a little town in Iowa to Waterloo. Well, there was no service any kind of service between Waterloo and Grinnell, except with the man who took the Des Moines paper to Waterloo in the afternoon. And so people who wanted to go to Waterloo, particularly college students, had devised the way of getting a ride back to Grinnell. Well, I tried that line and found that I could get back by train to Waterloo, and then I made arrangements for this man to pick me and my children up and bring us back to Grinnell. You see, my husband was using the car in his work. And so the children were in the back seat. It was a hot August day, very hot, and no air conditioning, of course. And I was sitting in the front seat with the man who was driving. And we were listening very intently to the radio because it seemed that the war was over in the Pacific. It was going to be over, and they were going to sign the declaration, or the Declaration of Peace in this instance. And the driver and I were listening very intently. And then it said, well, now it looks as if it's going to be, here comes General MacArthur and so and so and so and so. And I was quite breathless, and I looked at this man, and his arms were all goose pimply, just, and I said, you're all broken out. I have 2 boys in the Pacific, and that's all he said. And I never will forget the look in his eyes, nor will I remember how his hands were just like this and all bumpy. And he said, I have 2 boys, they'll be coming home. And really, I almost cried.
That's a wonderful story.
Isn't that a great story?
Yeah, it's a great story.
Yeah.
History teaches its lessons. Best of those about family and friends, about courage and neighboring, are still as good as new. We're grateful to Sid, Anna, Dick, Augusta, Martin, and Grant for their fascinating recollections. If you'd like to hear more of their experience, as well as those of others, you'll find audio tapes of 20 oral histories on loan at Grinnell's Stewart Library.